Before we get into this video, I am issuing a heavy content warning for all of the topics on screen. I am not exaggerating when I say that Mouthwashing is one of the most miserable games I have ever played in terms of content. If you find any of those things disturbing, it's alright if you skip this one. Stay safe out there. Some quick disclaimers are necessary before we begin. I'm not the best at literary analysis, and this is the largest project of this sort that I've ever attempted. I will miss some things, not understand others, and way overanalyze the rest. But I think that's sort of the beauty of media like this. Everyone has their own interpretation of what things might mean, and all of them are valid in their opinions. I would absolutely love to hear your ideas and thoughts about the game, as I'm sure you guys will have found things that I didn't. Also, in this video, I chose to order the story in chronological order, which importantly is not the order they are shown to us in-game. Because of this choice, this video will not show you the story how it was meant to be told. Instead, it will simply be an explanation and examination of events and the characters within it. This video will partially assume that you have already seen the game already, so if you'd like to experience the story as intended, I fully encourage you to buy and play the game yourself. If this isn't an option for you, I also have a full playthrough of it on my channel, which I'll link in the description. Anyways, with all that over with, let us begin with the story of Mouthwashing. We open the game to a grim scene of a man on a medical room bed. There is a sort of foam on the ceiling and a false window showing a peaceful ocean scene. After starting the game, we are introduced to our setting. We are on a long-haul space freighter called Tulpar for a company called Pony Express. The ship has a crew of 5 and has a projected travel time of just over a year. About a third of that time has passed. And lastly, we see the simple phrase of "I hope this hurts." Our story begins in the medical office of the ship. The ship's nurse, Anya, is just finishing the psychological evaluation on the ship's captain, Curly. She complains that he isn't open enough for the evaluation. He claims that as long as he's able to fly the ship, he doesn't really mind. The only thing that matters to him is his position as the captain. Anya talks about how she only has one evaluation left to do, and that's for the co-pilot, Jimmy. She confides in Curly about her lack of enthusiasm for talking to Jimmy and how he doesn't take the evaluations seriously, saying things like, "I have found myself sexually excited at the sight of cartoon horses." In reaction to this, Curly offers to do the evaluation in her place, taking that responsibility away. Curly goes to leave and conduct the evaluation, but not before saying a line that will be all too important for later, and that is, "I am the captain." And finally, Anya gives him a note from Swansea, the ship's head mechanic, which says, "I can't be expected to perform miracles." A sentiment that we later find rings very true, not just to Swansea. On the way to finding Jimmy and Swansea to talk to them, we find a board game in the lounge that looks very similar to the game Sorry. Curly comments that the group gets pretty heated during game night, especially Anya and Daisuke, the ship's intern. He comments that Daisuke is always insanely lucky, and that it drives Anya crazy. Other important notes about this board game is that if the colors match the characters, Daisuke pink is winning the game due to his luck, Swansea yellow is almost finished with all of his pieces at the end, Anya blue is stuck in the middle with most of her pieces scattered throughout, and Jimmy green is the only player yet to have a piece leaving the starting area. In other words, he's behind everyone else. Lastly, it may just be a coincidence, but the rest of the spaces on the board are white, which is the same color that represents Curly. He's what they all rely on. They need him even if he isn't really doing anything. I'll reference this board game a lot later, as I believe that this very simple set piece has a lot more symbolism to it than it lets on. We continue to find Jimmy outside the utility room. Jimmy and Curly talk about how the Tulpar is aging and how things always seem to be broken on the ship. We find out that Daisuke was not supposed to be on the crew and that he was added on at the last minute. Curly admits that he didn't make a big enough deal about this, as he should have. Daisuke isn't supposed to be here. This is further reinforced by the fact that there are only 4 emergency cryostasis pods on the ship. If something were to happen on the ship, one of them would have to be left behind. We enter the utility room to find a rather goofy scene. Daisuke is stuck in some insulation foam that we find out later is the ship's method of automatically patching holes that would lead to the interior's depressurization. Swansea comments that this happened because Daisuke is, quote, talented in all the wrong ways, and also that he would have fixed the problem himself, but unfortunately, Curly is the only one who can access the axe on board. This becomes a bit of a common theme for Curly, being the only one with the tools and ability to fix the ship's issues, for better or for worse. We retrieve the axe, free Daisuke, and begin talking to the mechanic duo once again. Swansea comments that the vent is incredibly dangerous and that it shouldn't be messed with. Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious. Daisuke retorts that he's the only one who could fit up there. Curly leaves and gives Swansea the axe, but not before reprimanding him for, quote, letting this happen, in an attempt to shove off some of the responsibility onto someone else. As for the note from earlier, I believe this is Swansea telling him that he can't do his job for him, if that makes sense, and we'll see just how important that is later. I'm going to be saying that a lot because I both want to analyze everything, but I also want to tell a story, so, it's kind of a hard balance, so you're going to hear, we'll talk about that later, and trust me, we will. Curly leaves the utility room to go conduct Jimmy's psych eval. After some banter, they reconvene at the cockpit. On the way, however, the ship appears to change. The hall to the cockpit is longer than usual, leading us down an impossibly long staircase. At the bottom, a dead end that we jump off of into an endless pool, surrounded by the vastness of space. Some may think that this pool is supposed to be blood, and I did as well at first, but I think that now it's supposed to be mouthwash. I'll address why later in this section. We begin to aimlessly traverse the pool until, suddenly, massive warning signs begin appearing above us, and a siren begins blaring. Additionally, broken ladders begin to appear out of the pool. After walking for some time, the sun rises in front of us, and we are thrust into an empty white void. The only thing there is a door, behind it, the ship's cockpit, with Jimmy waiting in his seat on the left. Before we get into the scene, I want to address the previous one and what I think it means. We find out later that the ship is transporting mouthwash, lots of it, and in the act of aimlessly wading through it, we see Curly attempting to metaphorically escape it, an impossible task given the endlessness of the pool. The warning signs and siren are both referring to the fact that the ship will eventually crash, but more so, I think that they are meant to signify the conversation with Jimmy that's about to happen. This conversation with Curly and Jimmy is full of red flags. Red flags that Curly decides to ignore, which is shown in the previous scene as Curly walking right past them into the sun, or what we'll find out soon is meant to be the consequences of his actions. As for the ladders, they are addressed in the conversation directly. Curly enters the cockpit to conduct Jimmy's psych eval. Jimmy remarks that he wishes Curly could just make something up for this evaluation, and that they don't ever lead to anything. Curly ignores this request, and the evaluation is conducted off-screen. The only question we get answered is to the first one of, have you been able to complete your mandated tasks as co-pilot efficiently and to your fullest capacity? Jimmy seems to struggle to find an answer. The evaluation ends and Curly begins to talk off the record and asks Jimmy how he's really doing. Jimmy says he likes it here because we're in control. Curly comments about how he's surprised that Jimmy is doing so well as he is on the ship, considering his reported struggle of a life back home. Jimmy ignores this and complains that he finds the praise around Curly's leadership annoying. He asks Curly why it seems like he's standing on the edge of a bridge with his feet in cement. Curly admits that he's been worried that this job isn't enough for him, and that he doesn't know if he should stay here because he's successful at it. He says that the success isn't a bad thing, but instead it's just scary. He worries that this is all he'll ever be, and that he desires to eventually try something new, even if he's bad at it. Jimmy comments that Curly must feel like he's climbed to the top of this particular ladder, but it might have been the wrong ladder. What's terrifying is the fall that would be included with changing ladders. It's interesting to me that Jimmy thinks the only way down a ladder is to fall. Anyways, he ends by commenting how he's still climbing. Curly comments that he believes in Jimmy's ability to climb his ladder before they are cut off by an oncoming message from corporate. The contents of the message aren't shown, but we'll address that later. For now, we are abruptly brought to a storage room with a television in its center. The television in front of us lays on an empty warehouse floor. After interacting with it, we can browse through each channel it has to offer. I'll try to explain what I think each particular show might mean, if anything at all. The first channel is an old-timey cartoon about the merits of being part of corporate life. It offers security, employee benefits, colorful and fulfilling working conditions, high wages, steady employment, health insurance, life insurance, vacation time, a savings account, home ownership, and leisure. The show then loops. The show is fairly surface level, I think. It shows what a corporation always promises in a lighthearted manner, whether it be true or not. Either way, the show ends with our cartoon character being injured, a small reminder that no matter what a corporate promises, it can always end up poorly. The next show is very short. It shows a star exploding and being absorbed by a black hole. What I think this is meant to represent is Curly's eventual injury in 7 days, leading to Jimmy taking command of the ship. Curly's responsibility is instantly removed, and Jimmy suddenly explodes because of it. The next show is sort of a documentary about atoms. It talks about the answer to a dream as old as man himself, a giant of limitless power at man's command. It says this power was found in the atom, which is responsible for creating everything in the world. It then ends. I believe this is a nod to the position of our cast under the Pony Express Corporation, and specifically Jimmy. Jimmy doesn't matter to the company, none of them do, but when you go into the ship and look at it in a vacuum, the captain of the ship has limitless power over the crew. How each captain chooses to use that power, well, we'll see. The next show is another cartoon. This one begins with a group of 4 men arguing about something until a salesman interrupts them by trying to sell them something called ism. He claims ism will result in higher wages, shorter hours, job security, profits, no strikes, government control, no worry about votes, bigger crops, lower costs, and the ability to name your own salary. I think that this is pretty obviously a representation of alcohol. People stressed with work might lean to alcohol to distract from their current situations, even if it doesn't fix anything. The more likely answer here, though, in my mind, is that this doctor, the snake oil salesman, is supposed to be Curly. All throughout the game, he could be seen mentioning that he can fix things, he can solve the problems of the crew. But that's not realistic, is it? It's his responsibility to take care of everyone's issues, but he can't do that. Whether it be that he isn't strong enough, or that he just doesn't have enough of a fucking spine, he can't do it. Throughout the story, we'll see the dichotomy of how having this responsibility affects Curly and Jimmy as they become captain. For Curly, he deals with the overwhelming pressure by caving in, and is so stressed by the action he needs to be taking that he ends up doing nothing. For Jimmy, the pressure simply makes him worse of a person. They put the most selfish person on the ship in charge, and we'll most certainly be seeing the effects of this later. The next show is one I'm truly lost on. Not because it's too complex or anything, but because I literally cannot see what's happening in the show. If anyone knows what this one means, please help me out here, because I have a feeling that this one's really important. The penultimate show is some sort of silent comedy of a dancing skeleton. The skeleton's leg falls off, and in attempting to retrieve it, the skeleton briefly falls apart, before finally getting up with its leg reattached. I'm not entirely sure what this one means, but my guess is it's something to do with Curly falling apart and the position of captain being refilled by Jimmy. It being a skeleton implies that it will fall apart again. And finally, the last show is more a commercial for the titular mouthwash. A brand called Dragon Breath shows off their revolutionary new dental hygiene product that kills 99.9% of bacteria and germs without leaving a bad taste. All day, fire fresh. I think it's pretty apparent that the symbolism here is much more important and widespread than just the commercial. I honestly can't say much about this here until we progress through the story, but we can certainly address it later. All I have to say now is that marketing your mouthwash as Dragon Breath isn't really a good idea, I think. I can't imagine a dragon's breath smells very good. The next day arrives and we're tasked with breaking the news to the crew about the message from corporate we received earlier. Arriving in the lounge, we are surprised by the rest of the crew with a birthday party. The crew only gets one communal birthday party per trip, and this year, it's for Curly. Unfortunately, Curly's responsibility extends to his birthday too, and he's the only one with a quote-unquote clearance to access the cake recipe. Before making the cake, we can speak to each member of the crew. None of them has anything too interesting to say, just light banter, but the conversation with Jimmy is ominous, to say the least. Claiming that he finds this whole thing to be a waste of time, but surprisingly, that he's looking forward to it. I don't think I need to explain it any more than I have, but Jimmy is an incredibly selfish man. He doesn't care for anyone but himself, so the fact that he's actually looking forward to Curly's celebration is weird, if not suspicious. We make the cake and return to the table where the crew demands we give a speech. We have a speech alright, but not one they want to hear. After telling the crew the contents of the message from corporate, we get to find out what it said for ourselves. The company they all work for, Pony Express, is being shut down. The world has moved past manned shipment companies and has assumedly moved on to automated systems. Their jobs are all effectively over, though they will be paid for this final shipment. The crew all has different reactions to this. Swansea seems to accept it. He recognizes that this is bad news for everyone else, but he's fortunate enough to be towards the end of his employment years anyways. Anya is ruined by the news. She says that she doesn't have any savings and perceives this as something the company is doing to them. As we'll come to understand later in the story, Anya knows this feeling all too well, this feeling of being left behind. Even in this conversation, no one addresses her concerns. She's miserable, and nobody at the table seems to care. Daisuke doesn't say anything for this conversation, but I think that means more than him just being quiet. Daisuke lives at the whims of his crewmates and the company he works under, more so than the rest of the crew, I think. As Jimmy comments in a second here, Daisuke will have this experience the easiest. His parents are rich, and he'll have a cushion to fall back on. I think that's why he's so innocent and cheery for the duration of the game. He doesn't really have a grasp on how serious the situation is, and because he doesn't have any power on the ship, well, he's just a damn good kid, trying his best. Jimmy has a lot to say about this, and I think it's here where any question about Jimmy's selfishness is thrown out the window. Jimmy is angry, rightfully, but he directs it in all the wrong places. Firstly, he accuses Curly of liking this outcome. The company ending means he gets to move on to a different job, one where he can be part of something bigger. Jimmy interprets this as Curly leaving them all behind, trying to escape the responsibility he has over the crew. And while I think that this is partially true, I don't think Curly truly feels like he's abandoning them. He didn't end the company, and just because he's lucky enough to be able to move on doesn't mean it's his fault. This feels like a projection for Jimmy. He's the selfish one, not Curly. Jimmy goes around the table and talks about what's going to happen to each one of them. He says he's going to have to go back to his quote-unquote struggle of a life. He comments on Anya's hopelessness in a rather scathing offense to her intellect, commenting on how she never got into medical school because of it. He points out Swansea's age and how the company's dissolving isn't really going to affect him. And he points out how Daisuke will just get to go home and try again, something none of them can really relate with. He talks about how Curly is the only one who will move on from this by growing and having a better life. He'll move up in the world. He's the lucky one. Jimmy's overwhelming jealousy and resentment for the respect Curly gets for what he perceives as a half-assed job is more than apparent. It showed itself earlier in the conversation with Curly during his evaluation, where he talked about how he found everyone talking about how great of a captain he was as annoying. Curly responds to this by saying that he's just working on his life being a place that he doesn't have to escape. Jimmy retorts that it's them he's trying to escape. Like he said, he thinks Curly is leaving them behind, regardless of if that's true or not. Again, projecting. He thinks Curly is doing this because it's what he would have done himself. But hey, nothing helps the pain of existential doom and corporate failure quite like cake, huh? We skip forward to a much shorter section with Anya and Curly. We're now 2 days before the crash. This section, though small, is one of the most important in the game to me, and it's where Anya's miserable story starts to become painfully apparent. I'm going to go through the scene and then explain what I think it means here. Anya is sitting in the lounge at the ship's equivalent of nighttime as Curly approaches her. He asks her what's up, and she comments that she can't sleep. Curly can relate to the feeling. Anya comments that she actually quite enjoys the nighttime window screen. It brings her comfort despite being fake. She points out that there's a dead pixel in the upper right corner. Curly doesn't see it. She says that she can't ignore it. In the back of her mind, it's always there. Curly says that the fact he can't see it is going to make him go crazy, and blames Anya for this newfound annoyance. Even then, he says it doesn't remove the illusion, because he's, quote, used to looking at the bigger picture. Anya asks him how much time they have left on their transport. Curly says it's about 237 days, to which Anya instantly converts it to being around 8 months. She brings the conversation to a close by asking Curly, why do you think the Pony Express put a lock on the medical room, but not the sleeping quarters? Curly replies that it's the same reason there's a lock on the cockpit, for safety. This conversation is so incredibly full of important topics, so excuse me if I sound like I'm crazy when I'm talking about it. Starting with the situation itself, Anya can't sleep. She's avoiding the sleeping quarters because they aren't a comfortable place for her, at least not right now. I believe that the nighttime window screen brings her comfort because it gives her hope of escape. She both feels trapped and ignored on the ship, so some time to be alone and just shut out the world is always nice. The dead pixel on the screen is obviously meant to represent Jimmy. A small but obvious problem that is most importantly out of Curly's sight. Curly is looking for it so hard that he's starting to get angry about it, even though it's right in front of his face. Jimmy is a problem, a ticking time bomb on the ship that's bound to explode sooner or later. Curly has the power to fix this, to stop him, but he just doesn't. He even says it himself. Even though there's an obvious problem right in front of him, it doesn't ruin the illusion for him. As long as he's at the controls, it's not an issue. At least not for him. For Anya, it's all she thinks about, and she can't escape it. And due to her position on the ship, she can't do anything about it either. The fact she knows how much time is left exactly is obvious enough. She is desperate to leave this place, and there's nothing she could do about it. And lastly, I hope I don't have to explain why the last few lines are so important. Why do you think the sleeping quarters not having a lock would be something Anya cared about? Well, she's the only woman on the ship. I'm sure you could figure out the rest for yourself. The cockpit is locked to keep the pilots safe, and the medical room is locked to avoid people getting into substances they shouldn't have. But the sleeping quarters? That's not a problem at all. Why would someone feel unsafe in their own bed? The next day has arrived, and we're thrust into a scene of desperation. Playing as Curly, we are tasked with, quote, finding the gun, which the ship apparently has. After searching for some time, we reach a cockpit, where we find Anya collapsed to her knees in tears. Curly demands she hand over the gun, because she thinks she took it to hurt herself. He thinks she would do this because they're being let go. He comments that she never got a psych eval, because she's the ship's nurse. Curly goats himself for not thinking of that, and we'll see just how bad of a mistake that was. I mean, it's shown multiple times that she's barely even able to do her job due to how much stress she's under. Just another way he let her down. She says that she could have come to him if she was so stressed, to which she retorts that he wouldn't have done anything anyways. He's the captain, and she's his responsibility, but that didn't stop him from failing her at every turn. She says she isn't going to hurt herself. Only the captain can open the case that holds the gun, so she hid the case itself. Curly demands she tell him where it is. He speaks to her like she's a child that's gotten in trouble, and she reveals why she did this. She's pregnant. Instead of actually consoling her here and offering a real solution, his initial reaction is to blame her. Before she cuts him off, he is in the middle of implying that she wanted this. It's not, who did this to you? It's, who would you do this with? Which makes a world of difference. She cuts him off and tells him that she's already told him. It was Jimmy, and Curly failed to realize it. Even then I think he knew, but didn't want to accept it. After all, Jimmy is his friend, his co-pilot. He wouldn't do something like this, would he? More importantly, Anya has told him before about this issue. He could have stopped this, but he didn't. Anya says that she hid the gun because she knew that Curly would never give it to her to protect herself, so she hid it to keep it away from Jimmy. She wouldn't use it unless she had to, but Curly can't see that, and lets her down once again. The symbolism of this conversation is pretty intense as well. When Anya reveals her pregnancy, the scene shifts to her crying in an empty void. It's her reality. Alone, miserable, with no one to help. Every attempt she's tried to make for some sort of help has been ruined. Notice the perspective of it as well. The camera is above her, looking down as she shrinks smaller and smaller. He doesn't even see her as a person, really, just another responsibility. It makes you wonder if he even wants to be here, or if he even cares. While Curly is talking about how he'll fix things and talk to Jimmy about it, the camera shifts over the controls of the ship. Jimmy's co-pilot seat is turned away from both Curly's pilot seat and the controls of the ship. A grim foreshadowing of how Jimmy will eventually ignore his duties in his own self-interest. He might be in the pilot seat, but he's avoiding the controls. Jimmy is the pure embodiment of what it means to be selfish, and it seems that no one is willing or able to challenge him. Before the scene ends, Curly grabs another message. This time it's a warning about some oncoming space debris. This scene personally hit me the hardest. As a victim of SA myself, I can report on that feeling of utter hopelessness that comes with it. You feel like you can't talk to anyone, and that no one cares. Her situation is obviously worse than my own, seeing as because of his action, she's now pregnant, with the baby of a man she doesn't trust. She only has 3 real options with how to deal with this. Carry the child for the next 8 months of the trip, conduct an unsafe abortion, or, well, you know. The next day begins outside the medical bay where we see Anya crying over the stretcher. Approaching her, she lets Curly know that she told Jimmy about the pregnancy. Curly scolds her, tells her that she should have waited for him. This was his responsibility after all, and she clearly couldn't handle it. She tells him that he didn't say anything that mattered. He's still a selfish person who only cares for himself. And Anya's attempt to maybe get to him, to maybe find some amount of empathy, failed, and she was left alone once again. She finally says what's on her mind. She doesn't want him on this ship anymore. Jimmy is a threat to her, and as we'll see, the rest of the crew as well. And he shouldn't be here anymore. Curly, still trying to be the hero, ignores her again and goes to find Jimmy. In wanting to make everyone happy, he's letting everyone behind, especially Anya. Curly finds Jimmy standing outside the cockpit hallway. He tells Jimmy he can fix this, another hopeless lie. Jimmy asks Curly what he thinks will happen when they get back home. He complains again about how he hears how great of a leader Curly is, and it infuriates him. He reiterates his question about what he thinks will happen when they get back. None of their accomplishments will matter, and everything in their lives will change. Jimmy blames Curly for everything that happened on the ship. It's his responsibility. Even though, in reality, every issue was initially caused by Jimmy and the company, Curly is still responsible within his inaction. He could have fixed this. He keeps saying it himself, we can fix this, we can get through this, we can move on together. But I think deep down, he knows that he's just as hopeless as the rest of them. He could have worked with Anya, could have let her sleep in the medical room with a lock on it, could have locked Jimmy out of the controls. He could have ensured that Anya was fit to be on the ship, same with Jimmy. He could have done so many things to stop what was to come, but he didn't, because he just wasn't good enough. Jimmy says that's what he'll be hearing for the rest of his life. It's your responsibility. Take care of it. It's either that or this can all be remembered as a tragedy. None of what happened on the ship has to be addressed if it's all destroyed. He's standing at the top, hands at the controls, with his feet in cement. The power to fix things without the spine to actually take the action needed to do so. The conversation ends with Jimmy putting a hand on Curly's shoulder. The words, "take care of it," and "kills 99% flash on the screen before Jimmy says the iconic line. I'll take care of it. Dragon Breath X Mouthwash. Kills 99.9% of all germs and bacteria, but not all of it. This time, it missed Jimmy. All day, fire fresh. We arrive in the cockpit. The ship speaks to us, tells us that an orbital body, an asteroid, has been detected near the vessel, and commands us to steer left to avoid it. We click on the controls, but our only option is to steer right. After doing this, the ship scolds us and engages its autopilot, but not before docking some of the crew's pay, of course. Nonetheless, we find the emergency key, put it in the console, and disengage the autopilot, ensuring our fate. We exit the cockpit to an endless maze of hallways and doors. No matter which way we turn, the company's mascot is around every corner. Behind us, it's everywhere. Additionally, the sounds of babies crying echo louder and louder throughout the halls. This was Jimmy's attempt to escape his responsibility of being a father. But you can't avoid responsibility, Jim. You made this bed of nails, and now you're damn well gonna lie in it. The game shifts perspective one last time to Curly. He races down the halls of the ship to the cockpit as the words "system failure" flash on the screen. I don't think this is talking about the ship here, either. I think Curly is the system failure in this instance. The crew is his system, and he failed them all. Jimmy sits silently on the floor outside the cockpit. He has nothing to say. He knows what he did, and he knows it's too late to fix things now. Curly runs into the cockpit just in time for the ship to make contact with the asteroid. He was too late, but let's be real. He couldn't have stopped this. Maybe someone else could, but he just wasn't good enough. Standing at the top, hands at the controls, with his feet in cement. Hi everyone, how are you doing? I'm setting aside this time in the story to give you a bit of a breather. We've just hit about the halfway mark of the story, and I want you to check in with yourself. This game has some pretty heavy topics, and if you're stressed out, you can always take a break. I'll be here when you get back. For now, I want to talk quickly about my feelings for this game. Without exaggeration, this is the best form of media I've ever had the privilege to experience, for better or for worse. I'm not kidding when I say I've lost sleep over this. This may be due to Anya's story dredging up some less than desirable memories for me, but even without that, this is the kind of game that just leaves you broken. There is no good ending. There is no sanctuary. It's just a really fucking miserable story. And we're not even halfway done. There's just so much to think about here, and I can only hope that this video does it a modicum of justice. A quick reminder that I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts about the game below, because currently, it's not a stretch to say that I'm obsessed with this particular story. Maybe I'm chasing a useless dream here, but boy do I hope that this video can help me move on, because man, I'll just say that I have a genuine worry that I won't ever find something as good as this. Anyways, thank you so much for watching this far into the video, and let's get right back into it. A major tonal shift happens once we move into the post-crash sections of the game. No one is really happy anymore, and the lounge is now a permanent shade of evening red, bathed in endless sunset. We now take control of Jimmy and begin at the table with the rest of the crew. That is, except Curly, of course. They are arguing. Jimmy wants to break into the ship's cargo hold in hopes for more food, water, or really anything that can help their situation. For better or for worse, the ship survived the crash. Most of it did, at least. The crew's quarters, the utility room, and the cryostasis pods are now blocked off by the same insulation foam from earlier. Daisuke and Jimmy have been camped out in the lounge. Swansea has been spending his time trying to break down the foam in the utility room. Anya has been staying in her office. The crew argues about getting into the cargo hold. Swansea believes it's locked down for a reason. Anya hopes that there could be something useful in there, and Daisuke just seems to want to check it out of curiosity. He offers to try and break into the hold with brute force, revealing that he has a history in baseball. An interesting fun fact is that he's actually named after a famous baseball player. The rest of them agree that this is a silly idea, and they work to find the alternate access code with a code scanner that only the captain, Jimmy, has access to. He even says it himself. For better or for worse, he is the captain now. On the way to find the scanner, we can speak to Daisuke, who is waiting in the lounge. It isn't too heavy of a conversation, but it's revealed that their remaining food will only last them 4 months, which if you remember is not long enough for the rest of the trip. It's also longer than their remaining air supply. Despite this incredibly pressing matter, Jimmy doesn't seem to really acknowledge it, simply saying that they'll figure things out. Daisuke comments that he can't wait to get home and tell their story. He figures they'll go down in history for surviving the incident. Keep in mind, the rest of the crew doesn't know that Jimmy was the one who tried to destroy the ship, not Curly. We can also find Swansea outside the utility room, preventing anyone from entering it. He claims that a solid wall of foam is in there, and that he's been slowly chipping away at it with the axe from earlier, and that he won't let anyone else help because it's such a delicate job. One wrong hit, and they'd all be sucked out into space. I think more importantly here, though, he doesn't trust Jimmy to touch it at all. He also mentioned how Anya was nearly injured by the vent hatch in the medical room during maintenance, reinforcing his idea that he's the only one with the real ability to fix these things. Lastly, when searching the medical room, we can find Anya standing next to Curly, or at least what's left of him. She talks about how uncomfortable she is around Curly. He won't sit still, and she finds feeding him painkillers to be immensely difficult. She just hates the noise. Jimmy berates her for being uncomfortable around injured people while being a nurse, and questions her status. She doesn't address that, instead addresses that the code scanner would most likely be in the cockpit. In a surprising move, Anya tries to instill confidence in Jimmy, calling him so capable. I'm honestly not too sure how to decipher this. She doesn't like him and has no reason to, so my guess is that it's an attempt to appease him to avoid any further conflict. It's a mess she's putting up because even if Curly didn't help much, he was the only one who was able to protect her, and he can't do that anymore. Before we're able to leave, though, she asks us to give the captain his painkillers. Jimmy interrupts her and insists she call him Curly, not Captain. He's the captain now. It's his title. Speaking of, Jimmy accepts this request, but not before commenting to Anya that people have to be worthy of their titles. Someone needs to take a look in the mirror. We give Curly his painkillers, and Jimmy tells him that pain is what makes us know we're living. Anya says she can't bear the sound and runs from the room. Thankfully, the administering of the pills is off screen, but it doesn't sound all too pleasant. We leave the medical room to find Anya collapsed in the lounge, crying. She asks Jimmy why he thinks he did it, referring to Curly crashing the ship. Jimmy asks her why it matters, and she responds with what I believe is the most important line in the story. I have to believe that our worst moments don't make us monsters. Anya says this in a conversation about Curly, but she isn't talking about him. She's talking about Jimmy. Even after all he's done to her, through the assault and abandon, she still needs to believe that there's at least some amount of redemption for Jimmy. Anya is a great example of how our trauma does not define us. She's a bright, cheery, funny, and competitive woman, as can be seen in her mannerisms and her reported investment during game night. Even after all she's been through, she still has hope, even if it's false. This is what gets to me most about her story. She's trying so hard to see the light in her situation, but at every turn there's another setback. This is the part of the story that really keeps me up at night, I think. It's the story of hope in a hopeless situation that makes it feel really miserable. Jimmy, still lying, claims that Curly tried to take them all down with him, when in reality that's exactly what Jimmy did. His life was over when they got home, and he couldn't accept the consequences of his actions, so he did the one thing he knew how to do. He tried to take them all down with him. It's not clear what they are, but Jimmy says that there's only 2 reasons they're keeping him alive. I think that one of them is that the other 3 outvoted Jimmy, and that they all have to keep him alive as a group. Either way, Anya can't handle the conversation anymore, and leaves. After retrieving the code scanner from the cockpit, Jimmy returns to the cargo hold and finds the rest of the crew waiting for him. Anya questions if they're doing the right thing, hoping for medicine, food, or water. What do they find in the cargo hold? Well, mouthwash. A whole warehouse full of it. The members of the crew will soon find out just how bad of an idea opening the cargo hold was. After all, this particular mouthwash is 14% ethanol, and who wouldn't want to drink away all this stress? This marks the beginning of the crew and especially Anya's unraveling. The isolation and uncertain future was already bad, but now they have a seemingly infinite supply of mouthwash to wash away their worries to. Swansea doesn't seem to mind it, ending his 15-year sobriety streak right then and there. Anya can't bear the situation. She knew that Jimmy was a lost cause at this point, but seeing Swansea let go that quickly shocked her to her core. She might have hope, but it seems that no one else on the ship can say the same. Daisuke doesn't seem to have much of an opinion about the situation. Speaking up doesn't really seem like his thing. And before we leave this scene to the next, I want to point out how Anya is the only one who seems the least bit concerned about this all. And yet again, no one is listening. We skip forward to a month later where Jimmy is woken by the pained screams of Curly. Checking on him, we find him in a worse state than usual, commenting that he needs his painkillers, but we're unsure if Anya has given him any yet. We find Anya and Swansea having a conversation in the cockpit. We catch the tail end of it, with Anya saying that she understands that's how it's supposed to be, whatever that is. Whether it be the conversation they were just having being something that Jimmy wasn't meant to hear, her simply being startled, or her natural reaction to seeing Jimmy at nighttime, Anya flinches when Jimmy enters the room. Jimmy interrogates them, saying that they all need to keep it together. Swansea claims that he's keeping it together all right. Don't you worry, Jimmy. Jimmy asks Anya about Curly's painkiller situation, and she admits that she forgot to give them to him. She apologizes and offers to go do it now, but Jimmy stops her, insisting that he be the one to take care of it instead. I think in his selfishness, Jimmy can't handle seeing Anya attempt to take any amount of control back in her life. Where Curly struggled to handle the captain position out of lack of initiative, Jimmy struggles because he believes he's the only one who could fix things. He stood on business where Curly didn't, but instead of anything getting done, it's only taking more control away from the crew, particularly Anya. Returning to Curly, Jimmy states how he knows what everyone is thinking, and that he doesn't know what to do about that. I'm not sure if Jimmy is referring to them likely planning to kill Curly, or them disliking his position as captain here. Maybe both. More importantly though, he comments that there's nothing she, Anya, could even do anyways. He's at the controls now, and his feet aren't stuck in cement. He knows she can't do anything about him now, and he revels in it. And before administering the pills, he blames Curly for putting him in this situation, even if it was entirely because of his own actions that got him there. This time, Jimmy seems a bit more violent about giving Curly his pills. We don't know what happened specifically, but there are sounds of beating and Curly crying as it happens. I'm choosing to interpret this as Jimmy beginning to slip. He already sucked as a person, but at the bare minimum, he was at least trying to help when he could. Power tripping aside, I think that this is his resentment for Curly's power over him finally spilling out. Curly was always above him, but now Jimmy controls everything about him, including whether he lives or dies. Jimmy stands up from Curly's stretcher and is thrust into the second of his hallucinations, the first being after he turned the ship to crash. It's obvious that these sequences aren't really happening, so what I think it might be is one of 2 things. They could be hallucinations or dreams that Jimmy is having aligning with his time on the ship, or they could be a purgatory-type situation where Jimmy has to relieve the sins of his life in his afterlife, which, spoilers, as if there weren't enough already, he does die. Anyways, in this sequence, we appear in the lounge with Curly sitting at the table with the cake in front of him. We are instructed to keep Sleopstir, or a Tekka Obslinistly? No, it's gotta be Etka. I don't know. In all seriousness, this rapidly changing text is telling Jimmy to take responsibility, and it's a reminder to Jimmy that he can't understand what it means, at least not yet. Like an instruction book in a different language, Jimmy knows he has to do something, but not what it means specifically. In the lounge, the false window's comfortable evening scene is now replaced by a massive emergency sign. There are also piles of mouthwash bottles on the ground. Sitting with Curly, he offers to have some cake with Jimmy. Jimmy asks him why, after all it's mediocre at best. Curly states that sometimes you can only get the subpar stuff, and that's what makes the really good stuff so good. Jimmy questions why they should even bother with the subpar stuff. Curly continues by saying that they all tried to escape, and that it didn't work for any of them. He admits that in his misery he's thought, is this what peace feels like? Is this feeling of being stuck in your own body without the responsibility what it means to be free? Is this what it took? And was it worth it? He comments that he doesn't like it, rightfully so, and that all he can do is to make his life one that he's not trying to run from all the time. Sometimes he'll be promoted, buy a house, fall in love, but other times he'll just have some awful fucking cake with his friend. He's accepting the subpar stuff because it makes the good stuff that much better. I think it's here that we see Curly doesn't even hate Jimmy for what he did. Like Anya, he's still looking for the good in Jimmy, even after all he's done to him. With all that said and done, Jimmy leaves to go find a knife to cut the cake with. He doesn't find a knife, but an axe, lodged into Curly's pilot seat in the cockpit. I mean, if the symbolism here isn't obvious, I don't know what to tell you. He literally cuts off Curly's legs. At least his feet aren't stuck in cement anymore. We take the axe and return to the lounge where we find Curly on the table, now in place of the cake. We are instructed to feast, ending the experience after bringing the axe down onto Curly. What I think we're seeing here is Jimmy literally feasting off of Curly's position as captain. Instead of a graceful passing of the title, Jimmy tore it away from him in a selfish act of jealousy. Another thing I'd like to point out is that before the crash, while Curly was captain, the window screen was always day. Curly wasn't the best captain for sure, but without Jimmy, things were moving pretty smoothly. After the crash, the crew is stuck in an eternal sunset, eternally stuck, approaching their end. I'm going to be honest here, I'm not too confident on my stance for this whole scene. There is a lot of stuff to keep track of, and honestly, I'm just happy I tried my best. But yeah, let's move on. Skipping forward a month after the crash, we get to see why opening this cargo hold was such a mistake. We immediately find Daisuke lying on the floor outside the cargo hold, drunk off of his mind. Because of this, though, we get a really good look into Daisuke's story. Speaking to him, he tells us that he knows the mouthwash will kill him before anything else. He's giving in, and from the looks of it, he's okay with dying before they get home. Daisuke, the ship's innocent little beacon of light, is breaking down, and Jimmy, shockingly, doesn't care. Daisuke tells us that his mom found this internship for him, and he took it because he didn't know what else to do. He digs into himself. He says that he was never really good at anything, a total screw-up. He says he hopes his mother doesn't blame herself for his fate on the ship. He says he isn't making it home. He knows he isn't making it home, especially not with Jimmy in charge. He asks Jimmy to take away the mouthwash. He does, but says nothing. Jimmy doesn't really care about Daisuke feels, he just doesn't want him to die on his watch. If we try to speak to Daisuke again, he asks to be alone, if that's okay. He's still asking for permission for everything, either because he knows that no one will listen due to his age, or because he's just too scared to stand up to Swansea and Jimmy. Daisuke's yielding to authority is a bit of a theme for him, and we'll touch on that much more when we get to his character analysis at the end of the video. Continuing to the lounge, we find Anya sitting at the table, staring at a bottle of mouthwash. By now, even she is considering letting go. She's so zoned out that she doesn't notice Jimmy sit next to her at the table. The camera angle changes to a wide shot, a bottle of mouthwash blocking Jimmy, all but confirming that he's the one the 99% of all germs thing is referring to. I actually can't decide here if he's supposed to be the mouthwash that ends up killing everyone else, or if he's the 0.1% that the mouthwash didn't kill. As far as I'm aware, we don't see Jimmy drinking the mouthwash at any point in the story, so I think that's more likely the case. Jimmy asks her if she's considering drinking it, to which she says she is. She recognizes that it probably wouldn't help, even if she'd like it to. I think she's again referring to Jimmy here. She knows that asking him for help wouldn't result in anything, but she doesn't have many other options. She continues by telling him that not all of the medicine on the ship was in her office, and that some of it was in a cabinet in the hallway. He asks her why she kept this from him, to which she simply says that she didn't think it was possible to reach due to it being covered up with foam. Or, what's more likely, she didn't think anyone would listen to her. Why would she? After telling him that it might be possible to break away the foam, he reminds her that if they weren't careful, he might break through and suck them out into space. She knows this, and he knows she knows this, but he still needs to be the smarter one anyways. Either way, Jimmy actually listens this time, and goes to retrieve the axe from Swansea. Approaching Swansea, we can see that he's pretty far gone. His words make little sense, and he's dancing around wildly with the axe. You know, normal mechanic stuff. He talks about how the axe was entrusted to him by the previous captain and that it's a big responsibility, something Jimmy wouldn't know much about. Jimmy claims that he's just trying to get more painkillers. He's trying to do something useful. The delusion here that Swansea hasn't been helping is very interesting to me. Swansea has been helping where he can, and Jimmy projecting his lack of productivity here is almost too obvious. Swansea accuses him of trying to abandon the crew when Jimmy says he's just trying to help. Swansea then turns around and slams the axe into the window screen, shattering it. I honestly don't know why he does this, but I think I'm fine with it just being because of his drunken state. I think that he knows Jimmy shouldn't be trusted with the responsibility of the axe, let alone a weapon in general, but that he also knows that there's nothing he can do about that, so he begrudgingly gives it up. This could also be a way of telling us, the viewer, that there really is truly no escape, not even a false one. We find the cabinet, carefully uncover it, and retrieve some more painkillers along with a bottle of isopropyl alcohol, a medical disinfectant. We turn around to find Anya ominously standing behind us, no real concern for her own safety if Jimmy were to mess up. She congratulates him on getting it done, to which Jimmy replies that it wasn't too hard once he got a hang of it. This, to me, is Jimmy experiencing what it's actually like to get something productive done for once. Too bad he doesn't really learn from this experience. She says that this feat is amazing, which I'm choosing to interpret as sarcasm. I too would be surprised about Jimmy actually being able to do something right in his life. She asks Jimmy to give Curly his meds again, but he's tired of it. He says that he's, quote, entertained her sentimentality up until now, but he's actually trying to fix things. But what is he really doing? Everything is getting worse with him in charge, and he can't even handle doing a responsibility that he was already doing. He complains about all the things he's had to do, now that he's captain. Find the code scanner, figure out the door code, get the axe, chop up the phone, but not too much, and best of all, give Curly his fucking medicine. Also known as the bare minimum. No attempts to contact help, no attempts to fix things that matter on the ship. No real attempt to actually change their situation for the better. He thinks that he's the only one trying to fix things, when in reality he's not doing anything beyond the bare minimum requirement of what he needs to do as captain. He says he's bearing it because he has to, because he's the captain. But a true captain doesn't help because he has to, he does because he wants to. A true captain actually cares about his crew, something Jimmy clearly struggles with. Anya apologizes, she only wanted a little help. Jimmy directs her to go make sure Daisuke is alright, something that he could have done, but another responsibility that he failed to do. She insists that she can handle it, but Jimmy isn't hearing any of it. He'll take care of it. He always does. Upon finding Curly and administering his meds, Jimmy admits that he didn't understand the pressure Curly was under until now. He admits that he should have listened to Curly when he told him how much pressure he was under, but since Jimmy only ever thinks of himself, he didn't really care. He reiterates Anya's line of "our worst moments don't make us monsters," because he actually thinks that he's doing the right thing for once. He tells Curly that he was a good captain and that he'll be one again. Jimmy will get them both through this. Jimmy will take care of it. The administering of the pills is easier this time, except for the sounds of crying at the end. Since they don't have voice actors, this could either be Curly or Jimmy crying, but I'm pretty sure it's Curly. See, this, I think, is the start of when Jimmy truly begins to believe that he's the only one with the answers. He's not saying that he'll get them all through this because it actually makes him feel better, but he's saying it because he genuinely believes it. Curly sees this too, and knows that it's only going to get worse. He knows that under Jimmy, the crew is more or less doomed. So he cries. He could have stopped this. Another month passes and we are aimlessly walking through the lounge before a panicked Daisuke approaches us from behind. He says that Anya is stuck in the medical room. What if she runs out of something? What if she runs out of food, water, or patience? Jimmy, with absolutely zero urgency, agrees to take a look. He doesn't address the issue with the seriousness it requires. We already know that he doesn't care about Anya, but both Curly and their medical supplies are in there, and he still treats it like a chore. Approaching the medical room door, they attempt to speak with Anya through the other side. Daisuke tells her that they're here to rescue her. Jimmy speaks to Anya through the door. She ignores him at first, but relents after Jimmy presses further. She isn't panicking at all. Her words are calm, collected. Jimmy points out that the rest of their medical supplies are in there as well. Anya and Curly are inside. What if he were to get hurt? He asks if Anya really tried to open the door, and Daisuke offers another brute force approach. After some silence, Jimmy asks Anya if the door is really stuck. Anya admits that it isn't. She locked herself in there. Jimmy says that they're all stressed and that she can't go breaking down at every hardship. But she isn't breaking down. Like I said, she's calm. She's in control here. She tells Jimmy that he was right all along. She should have done this from the beginning. She says that she always believed that their worst moments didn't define them, that they didn't make them beyond repair. But she sees now that for Jimmy, that just isn't true. Do you think she wanted this outcome? This isn't her worst moment. No, this is the best decision she's ever made. She's finally in control, and she isn't going to let Jimmy step over her again. She's taking matters into her own hands, doing what he wanted to do but couldn't. As to what that means, we'll see in a bit. Sorry, I know this is supposed to be an analysis, but a little bit of suspense is always fun. Jimmy asks Daisuke if there's any other ways into the medical room, and Daisuke says that even though it's incredibly unsafe, the vent into the utility room does connect to medical. So they leave to go access the vent. Before they go, Jimmy shouts to Anya that they're coming in. It isn't hopeful, this is a threat. God knows what he'd do to Anya after a stunt like this. He's already hurt her in every way imaginable, so it's concerning to think about what he'd do in a situation where she directly gets in his way. Finding their way to the utility room, they see a disheveled Swansea sitting outside. He's too far gone at this point, and is too stubborn on not letting them into the utility room. He says that letting Jimmy help with this would be pointless, and that he'd only make it worse. Either way, they aren't getting in there. Jimmy and Daisuke continue their conversation in the hallway. They need to get to the vent, but Daisuke agrees that it would be far too dangerous even if they could access it. What's interesting is that he doesn't really seem all too concerned about the actual safety of the utility room and the vent, but he's more concerned about fucking up again. He can't bear to disappoint anyone again. Jimmy conveys the urgency of the situation, saying that he wouldn't put it past Anya to do something extreme. He still only sees her as an anxious mess who can't even do her job right, not as, let's be real, the only level-headed person on the ship right now. He sees her as a threat, which she could be to Curly, but not once did it occur to him that she locked herself in there to be away from Jimmy. Jimmy continues to manipulate Daisuke in this moment, telling him that Curly is relying on them. Doesn't Daisuke want to be the hero? They create a plan to give Swansea a spiked drink to knock him out and take the utility room keys. Again, no concern for Swansea's safety here, but that shouldn't really surprise you. Using a combination of the mouthwash and isopropyl alcohol from earlier with some sweetener, they create the spiked drink. An interesting point that I'll hone in on more later is that since the ingredient maker is now covered in foam, we have to find sweetener hidden in Daisuke's sleeping bag. I think this really points out that he's just a kid and that he really shouldn't be here. None of them should, but especially him due to his lack of maturity. After making the drink, Daisuke comments that he can picture himself with a few of those on the beach with some hot babes by his side. But then he'd drink too many and throw them up all over himself and never be able to look at it again. I think this is just another example of his self-deprecation and lack of confidence due to his position of zero authority. He wants to be an idealized image of himself, but is too self-deprecating to actually think it possible. They return to Swansea and give him the drink. Jimmy lies and pretends like it's a peace offering to Swansea to get them on good terms. Daisuke comments that they freestyled the recipe. Swansea replies that he can tell he helped create this monstrosity of a drink. He's no mixologist, and on top of that, he's no mechanic either. Swansea tells him that he never should have come here. It's a rather scathing speech from Swansea, but I don't think it's because he's mad at Daisuke himself. No, he's mad that the world is a place where someone as innocent as Daisuke can be put into a situation like this. He recognizes that Daisuke wasn't prepared for this, even without the crash. Jimmy says that wallowing doesn't suit Swansea, to which he retorts that Jimmy probably thinks that they should all be acting like him. He tells Jimmy that he should take a load off before fate claims the crew, that he should stop trying. Lastly, he proclaims one more thing. May they never make it to hell, but always be on their way. He takes the drink and, rather violently, collapses to the ground. Daisuke is panicked as the reality of the situation hits him, but Jimmy still doesn't care. Daisuke is both terrified for Swansea and terrified about how much trouble he'll be in when he wakes up. After unlocking the utility room, Daisuke continues with his worries. It's not too late to turn back and just talk it over with Swansea, even if he'd get in trouble for it. Jimmy continues to manipulate him with false confidence, telling him it's time to be brave, that Anya and Curly are counting on them. They open the utility room to a rather shocking scene. There's barely any foam left, and one of the cryostasis pods is still functioning. Getting in one wouldn't guarantee your safety, but it would give you 20 years more of a chance to be found. This isn't right. No, Swansea didn't clear all of this up. It was never foamed up in the first place. Jimmy interprets this to be a selfish act, to be the one to make it out alive by Swansea, but this is just another projection. Jimmy says that he'd definitely take the 20 years of a chance to be found, but would never do it by lying and waiting for everyone else to die. Nonetheless, they agree to stick to the task at hand and move to the vent. Daisuke comments on how unsafe it looks. Sharks. Sparks are literally flying off of the exposed wiring around it. But that's not Jimmy's problem. Jimmy commands Daisuke to enter the vent and reach Anya, but not without some more healthy doses of manipulation. He claims that if he makes it through, Swansea will be proud of him. Isn't that what he wants? Daisuke climbs through the vent and it seems to be going great, until... Hey gang, one more intermission for you guys. We're about to move into the really, really miserable part of this game, where our content warnings start to come into play more than they ever did. I'm gonna put them back on screen for you guys just in case. I'm not gonna drag this intermission on for too long, so yeah, let's just continue to the final part of Mouthwashing. The endgame begins with a scene of the aftermath of Daisuke's experience in the vent. He's gravely injured, bleeding out, and in insurmountable pain. Jimmy shouts at Daisuke not to move, and that he can fix this. Bizarrely, he tells Daisuke to stop. He doesn't want Daisuke to stop bleeding because he values his life. Instead, he perceives this as something that's being done to him, another annoyance. Swansea is with him and berates Jimmy for saying that he can fix things when he's shown time and time again that he can't. Even when he is in what is likely the most pain he's ever been in his life, knocking on death's door, Daisuke still apologizes. He still thinks this is his fault. God, the poor kid. Swansea commands Jimmy to retrieve the disinfectant, the isopropyl alcohol from earlier, to help Daisuke, but he doesn't have it anymore. In his selfish act of veiled heroism, he wasted the one resource they actually needed. Jimmy fucked it up. Again. Even then, he still blames it on Swansea, failing to recognize that he was doing more to protect them than Jimmy ever could. So, we're instructed to find an alternative. We check the obvious places first, but the cabinet is empty and the medical room yields no results, which we know because Swansea is somehow already in there looking. The left side of the medical room is bizarrely obstructed for some reason. There must not be anything important over there. We continue our search until we find a gravestone in the downstairs hallway. Here is, unfortunately, another case where the pixelated graphics of the game work against me because I genuinely cannot tell what it says on the gravestone. If anyone knows, it would be very nice if you told me, because it's kind of driving me insane. Then again, maybe it's supposed to be obscured because it's just another thing that Jimmy is ignoring. Anyways, after using the code scanner on the gravestone, we are transported to a Hogwarts house-esque version of the cargo hold. We walk down a seemingly endless staircase following a blood trail that we can only see with the code scanner. We can only see the damage we've done through the eyes of the captain, eyes that Jimmy doesn't have. On the way down, we hear the company's mascot somewhere below us, but it isn't as friendly as usual. Eventually, the words "Be quiet" flash on the screen, and we're transported to a new area above the cargo hold. Shelves of boxes seemingly endlessly surround us in the empty room, but we're not alone. A notepad ominously states, "A blind beast, aimless and restless. You can't run from it." We next have to navigate the top of the warehouse while an invisible and blind monster pursues us. Thankfully, we seem to be wearing God's heaviest shoes and are physically incapable of not stomping everywhere. If we're not careful, the monster gets too close to us, we can get a glimpse of what it actually looks like with the black light of the code scanner. It's a massive horse, the mascot of the Pony Express. I'm interpreting this as Jimmy attempting to ignore or escape his responsibility. He's following the blood trail because he's the captain, not because he's Jimmy. This sequence is a bit hard to pin down for me. Either it's a representation of the company's lack of care for them, chewing them up and spitting them out as the persistent machine of capitalism often does. You can't see it coming. That, or it's not that the monster is blind, but Jimmy is blind to it as well. The monster is responsibility, and Jimmy is literally blind to it as its inevitability chases him down. We reach the end of the trail just to find Polly the pony with our disinfectant. Mouthwash. Who could have guessed? Even though we try to avoid it, responsibility arrived all the same. We return to Daisuke with the disinfectant. He's still writhing back and forth, worse than when we left him. On top of that, he's still apologizing. God, I feel so bad for this kid. Swansea was right. He shouldn't have been here. The crew didn't deserve any of this, but especially not Daisuke. He's just a kid. Whether he wants it or not, Jimmy forces the mouthwash on Daisuke. But it didn't help. Daisuke is still bleeding out and his time left is wearing thin. Swansea grabs the axe. Daisuke was never supposed to be here and he never could become like miserable old Swansea. What a shame. The American dream, pulling himself up by his bootstraps, it got him nowhere. He always thought that Daisuke wasn't the brightest, a useless ray of goddamn sunshine. He was never anything special in the eyes of the company, but that didn't matter. What mattered is that he was a good kid. Just a damn good kid trying his best. He just wasn't ready for this world, and, well, he doesn't deserve to suffer any longer. Close your eyes, Daisuke. Jimmy calls Swansea a monster, but just like Anya, Swansea made a decision that Jimmy wasn't able to make himself. This needed to happen. Daisuke didn't stand a chance. Not without Anya or the disinfectant, at least. This was the best thing that could have happened to him. Jimmy berates Swansea. He claims that he could have fixed things, and that none of this would have happened if any of them gave him time to fucking think. But that wasn't the issue, was it, Jimmy? The issue was that Jimmy could never have figured it out on his own. He just wasn't good enough. Swansea's done with this. He gives it to Jimmy straight. They never had a chance, and this isn't just Swansea's nihilism speaking. It's the goddamn truth. Daisuke won't suffer another second because of Jimmy's delusions. Jimmy ignores this and confronts Swansea with his so-called plan. Sneaking around in the utility room, telling Anya who knows what, and now he kills his intern? Oh, Jimmy. Swansea sure talked to Anya, but it was her telling him all kinds of things, wasn't it? You know what you did, Jimmy. This is your fucking fault. Swansea never wanted to escape alone. He's moved on. He's at the end of the road anyways, and even if he's a miserable old bastard, he doesn't hold a candle to the selfishness of Jimmy. He doesn't care anymore. So go ahead and get in the pod, Jimmy, but shouldn't a captain go down with a ship? Swansea disappears and we're instructed to find the gun. Anya was the one who hid it, so the most logical place we check is the medical room. And, well, here's where the content warning really comes into play. Anya wasn't going to let the ship or Jimmy be the ones who killed her. Her whole time on this ship has been spent with zero control over her life and no hope of escaping it. This was the best decision she'd ever make. This part hit me particularly hard, I think, due to its misery. I don't want to dwell on it too long. There might be more to say about this moment, but I really don't want to think about it too much, if that's okay. I hope you guys can understand. For now, I'll just point out that the method she used was to take the rest of the painkillers. She just couldn't bear the stress any longer. Also, remember when this side of the room was blurred out earlier? Yeah, Anya's body would have been there during that scene, but what I think this means is that Jimmy was ignoring it. He had so little care for her that he physically blocked out her dead body out of his mind. There's a chance that he couldn't bear to look. I wouldn't blame him, but I don't think that's the case. Jimmy is so consumed with himself that he physically couldn't see the consequences of his actions. On the bright side, at least Curly is still alive. We find the gun in the undercarriage of the stretcher. We take it, and Curly begins to laugh. We stand up, turn around to leave the room, and we are confronted with Swansea, charging us with his axe. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this part is supposed to happen before or after the previous section. Either way, there's a short scene where Jimmy has shut himself inside the cockpit. Finding a piece of rope and a pipe to secure the door, Swansea shouts at us from the other side, threatening to kill us. After securing the door, Swansea breaks through the glass of the window and reaches for the lever inside. Again, I can't really tell if this is supposed to happen before or after the previous section. My guess is after, because why would this happen in between Daisuke's final scenes? At the same time, though, the previous section ended with Swansea attacking us in a different hallway. How is it possible that he had us cornered twice? My only guess is that this section is another hallucination, that what happened after finding Anya's body was real, and that this is another hallucination of Jimmy perceiving himself as the victim. He didn't kill Daisuke or Anya, so Swansea must be the true monster here, right? That's just my guess, at least. But other than that, I'm at a complete loss. Maybe this is Jimmy's way of leaving the last of the crew behind by physically locking Swansea out of the cockpit, away from the controls. We return to the medical room. Jimmy is carrying Curly, who stares at him silently. Not that he could talk much, but, you know. We bring him to the dining table, where Jimmy has set up the rest of the crew's bodies as if it's the party all over again. The bodies of the crew clap for him and wish him a happy birthday. Anya tells him to give a speech, to which the rest of them agree. Jimmy picks up the knife. Finding it in our inventory, we are instructed to, quote, get the job done. Then, Jimmy begins his speech. He berates Curly, saying that a lot of people struggle to put food on their plate, and that the lowest rung of his ladder was their highest. He accuses Curly of thinking that life wasn't even worth living at the same level as them. Even then, he says that the crew forgives him. The camera pans out to show the reality of the scene. The rest of the crew is dead, and Jimmy has officially left reality. He continues, "Sometimes we thrive, travel the endless reaches of space, but other times we have to accept days like these." That's what Curly taught him. The subpar stuff makes the really good stuff, well, good, right? He finishes by declaring, "Let's eat. Let's survive." This whole scene is the beginning of the acclaimed Judgement that we've been leading up to. The rest of the functioning crew has died, and now Jimmy has a decision to make. Who's getting in that cryopod? Unfortunately, things aren't looking too great for Curly, as Jimmy still thinks that he's been doing the right thing. He hallucinates the crew being proud of him, and he imagines himself in the place of Curly at the previous party. He always hated hearing about how great of a captain Curly was, and now he's finally getting to experience what he's always wanted. To be appreciated, even if he didn't deserve it. They are trapped in an endless sunset, and God isn't watching. And so begins the ever-approaching Judgment. The previously unclear text is now all too clear. It's time for Jimmy to take responsibility. The Judgment sequence is sectioned so that Jimmy has to atone for each one of the deaths he's caused. Starting with Daisuke, we enter the medical room to see the utility room keys hanging above the vent that eventually led to his death. We reach for the keys but fall into the vent below. Just like Daisuke, we have no control over this situation and are forced to enter a place no human should have ever been. The vent is abnormally spacious. On the way through it, we find a toolbox with 2 pieces of the Sorry game from earlier on top of it, and another on the floor. Sorry. How fitting. These pieces are green and pink for Jimmy and Daisuke, respectively. One pink piece is on its side, and the other is on the floor, while the green one stands above them both. I think this shows how Jimmy abandoned and used Daisuke. Daisuke would do anything for Jimmy, and he made sure to take advantage of that. He used Daisuke like a tool, and it led to his death. Turning another corner, we find Daisuke himself. Where previously he would have followed us anywhere, he turns away. he abandons us, just like Jimmy did to him. Attempting to reach him, he disappears, a flower laying on the ground in his place. These flowers appear multiple times throughout the game, and especially during this section. I don't know what they mean specifically, but my guess is that they're just supposed to represent a member of the crew's death. A beautiful thing gained from the death of another person. A sign of Jimmy only gaining from the death of his friends. Continuing down the vent, we are transported to another vent without walls. A grate on the wall has a note on it simply stating, "No turning back now," which is very similar to what happens if you interact with the monitor during the crash sequence where Jimmy dooms the ship. Attempting to turn away from it, the game forces us back with the all-too-familiar "take care of it" flashing on the screen. Instead, we must run backwards away from the grate. We're running away from our responsibility again, but in reality, we arrive at it all the same. As we're running, we see a pile of weights, flowers, and a Game Boy, surrounded by the hands of the dead crew. I understand what the flowers and weights are supposed to be, showing how Jimmy got rid of them as if they were dead weight. As for the Game Boy, I've got no clue. Maybe it's supposed to be a representation of Daisuke's childhood being stripped away from him or something like that, but I really have no idea. But that's what's so fun about these sorts of things, right? The best answers often come from other people, I think. So, as always, let me know what you think this one means in the comments below. The final grate we see has a red paper with the word responsibility on it. Instead of taking it, we run yet again. We keep running backwards until we appear in the back halls of the ship. The walls are twisted and there's empty bottles of mouthwash scattered on the ground. The hall dips downward into a drop onto a set of doorways. Opening the one below us sends us into another freefall. We approach a hole in the middle of 8 gravestones and a casket surrounded by some trees. Again, I unfortunately don't understand this one much. The 8 gravestones are actually 4 pairs of duplicate gravestones, which would make a lot more sense considering there are 4 other crew members. But Curly and Jimmy are still alive, so even if there were only 4, it still wouldn't make a lot of sense. The casket is also a strange one for me. Between the pixelated graphics and the fact we're falling, you don't get a good look at the scene in the game. I think that maybe that's the point here. Something about Jimmy ignoring his fate while being dragged into it against his will, and ignoring the things he did to get here. He's finally feeling what others felt around him, especially Anya. Powerless. The hole is lined with countless posters of the Pony Express company. Motivational posters as if to taunt Jimmy with the ever-repeating, "We'll get through this, you'll take care of it, you're the captain." We land on another door that, upon opening, places us into another room. A sideways version of the medical room with the vent that was previously on the wall is now waist height, prompting us to climb in. The vent is surrounded by axes lodged into what would have been the floor. This is a representation of how the vent only meant death. It was incredibly dangerous and Jimmy knew that, but he didn't care. Continuing the theme of going through what Daisuke did, we crawl into the vent. This time, it's a lot more accurate to what it was actually like for Daisuke. Cramped and uncomfortable, we crawl forwards until we eventually find a part of the vent lit up red with a flower laying in front of us. This is where Daisuke was injured. Turning around, an axe slams into the wall of the vent, as if to both confirm that suspicion and to really rub it into Jimmy about what he forced that poor kid to do. Falling through the hole at the end of this vent, we find Swansea tied to a chair, with the gun laying on the ground in front of him. Neither man says anything, and upon picking up the weapon, the only way to progress is to shoot him. This scene solidifies to me that none of them had to die. Swansea literally had his hands tied behind his back, and yet Jimmy shoots him anyways. Swansea being tied up here could also represent his alcoholism, holding him back during the story. I'm not blaming him, but Swansea was the only one who had the mental fortitude to stand up to Jimmy. However, between his nihilism and him constantly being inebriated, he didn't take the action needed until it was too late. Shooting him transports us to a cramped cemetery. It's quiet and foggy. In the center, there is a memorial for Daisuke. After getting a good look at it, we suddenly hear footsteps ring out from somewhere in the cemetery. We're being hunted. Or at least, that's how Jimmy perceives it. What follows is a tense scene where we need to listen intently for the hunter to know where he is coming from. It's Swansea. He's trying to kill us to pay for what we did to him and the rest of the crew. We are forced to shoot him 3 times to progress. I think this scene is meant to ask Jimmy if he really wanted this ending. It makes him shoot Swansea 3 times in what he perceives as self-defense, but in reality is Swansea trying to either defend or take revenge for Daisuke's death. After shooting Swansea 3 times, we are transported to a scene in a white void with the silhouettes of Jimmy and Swansea standing across from one another. Swansea is sitting in a chair, but his hands aren't tied behind his back anymore. He begins to speak, but it isn't in the joking manner we're used to. Swansea is serious this time. He has something to say, and Jimmy is damn well gonna listen. What follows is a lengthy scene of Swansea recounting his life up until this moment. He'd spent 13 years drunk on the streets until he was scared straight by the sight of a streetlight above him. Visions of his body lying in a ditch. He saw the signs and chose to turn his life around. He says that he hoped he could have made his children better than he was, that his fulfillment in life came from the victory of others. He talks about all the accomplishments that he'd gotten up until then. Good kids, a wife, a steady job. But addressing Jimmy directly, he tells him that those accomplishments never felt as good as he expected when he crossed the finish line. But what makes him any different from Jimmy if neither of them were able to recognize their worth and were never appreciative of the things they did? The difference is, Swansea recognized that those years of selfish abandon were amazing for him. He knows that he, personally, might have been happier to stay a drunkard. But instead, he realized that what separates a happy person from a good person is their real effect on others. Swansea recognizes that our worst moments don't make us monsters. Swansea sees himself for what he is. But Jimmy? A cowardly, selfish motherfucker, and he can't even see it. Jimmy's still delusional, though, confirming Swansea's accusations himself by continuing the idea that he can still fix everything. But does he even hear himself? Everyone else on the ship is dead except for Curly, who might as well be, and it's all because of Jimmy. He might not have directly murdered them, but it was him who tormented Anya until she couldn't stand to live in a world with him anymore. It was him who manipulated Daisuke into a dangerous environment by abusing his fear of authority, and it was he whose actions pushed a man who had turned his life around right back to violence. He may not have caused their death directly, but in the end, it was his goddamn fault, whether he thinks so or not. After cursing Jimmy for one final time, Jimmy raises the gun and finishes the job he started. We return to a partial reality. Jimmy had Swansea tied up in the utility room, which don't ask me why he bothered to drag him here all the way from the medical room. Leaving the gun behind, we are instructed to take responsibility once more. Sprinting forward, the halls of the ship begin to contort once again, as they seem to turn in impossible directions. Jimmy is finally, genuinely trying to take responsibility, but he doesn't know how. Running blindly, even if the answers are right in front of him. Along the way, Curly appears below us in the floor, as if to say, "See, I told you so. You weren't ready, and now you get to face the music." We continue sprinting down an endless spiraling hallway. Eyes begin to appear on the walls around us until it's all we can, well, see. All eyes are on Jimmy to do the right thing for once, make the right decision, but in the end, as surprise to no one, Jimmy is thrust into more chaos as he gives up and turns away from his responsibilities once again. We appear inside an esophagus and run to escape it. Finding the exit, we see that we were inside Curly, his eye gone dark and his mouth agape. Jimmy's eventual rise to the captain position only happened at the expense of his friend. What follows is a truly gruesome sequence. Curly is positioned upright and is covered in valves. He is surrounded by monitors that picture his insides. Across from him, another television that, after a short cartoon, commands us to feast. We must take Curly's leg that we took from him earlier, and, well, feast. Curly's entire life is mercy to the whims of Jimmy's selfishness now, and it's entirely up to Jimmy to make the right call. What better way to show us this than literally covering him in valves with which we can mold him until he's right again, until he works. I think this speaks to Curly as well. He had all the right ideas and intentions, but they just weren't in the right places. After successfully righting Curly's body and returning what we took from him earlier, the television behind us changes its channel. The words "help me" are plastered over the screen. Approaching it, we see Jimmy alone in space, just like he wanted, right? But this isn't right. This doesn't feel good. Is this what peace feels like? We traverse this empty plane until the television disappears and we are confronted by Curly once again. He's sitting in the same seat as Swansea did earlier, and it's his turn to speak. Curly speaks honestly. He wants to go home. Why doesn't Jimmy just finish what he started? What's stopping him from killing Curly and getting in the cryopod himself? What's stopping him from saving his image and telling his version of the events that happened to the Twilight crew of the Tulpar. Curly admits that he could have prevented all of this, that he's taking responsibility for his mistakes and accepting whatever happens next. But Jimmy can't do that, continuing once again by promising Curly that they can both be the heroes. He delusionally claims that the crash was an accident, that it could have been avoided, a blatant lie only meant to make himself feel better once again. He screams his apology to Curly, but Curly isn't having any of it. Jimmy clearly isn't ready to take responsibility. Tears are not, so the atonement continues. Back in the vents, we find a massive fleshy growth on the wall. We take what I think is either supposed to be an ultrasound or an X-ray machine. Pills in a medical box surround it, but this scene isn't for Anya. Approaching the growth on the wall, we must use the machine to find 3 horses within it, exterminating them. We tried to get rid of the problem. We're trying to fix things. Finding out about the pregnancy he forced on Anya was what pushed him to try and destroy everything, to avoid the responsibility of being a father, for caring for another human. But I mean, I don't think I need to say it again about how this isn't acceptable. Jimmy can't avoid responsibility forever, and this time it's coming for him directly. All clean. Really gets rid of that bad taste in your mouth, huh? Through wreckage, through silence, wash it away. All day fire fresh. I hope this hurts. Despite what Jimmy thinks about his situation, that the child was something to be fixed, to be undone, you can't just get rid of your responsibility no matter how hard you try to run from it. Jimmy isn't a victim of circumstance, he's a monster. No matter what Anya chose to think of him, he only stood to gain from all the misery he bestowed upon the crew. And let's be real, the only real reason he's so scared right now is because he didn't expect himself to actually regret his actions. Not because he's any amount of sorry. Back in the events, we find our baby, a grotesque centipede-like abomination of the company's mascot. We attempt to push past it again, ignoring that it's even there, but that isn't taking responsibility. The monster begins to pursue us. We run aimlessly through the vent system, dodging the physical representation of the pain we caused at every corner. Jimmy doesn't know what to do, and he can't turn back now. Running from responsibility, we enter the final area of the Judgement sequence. Employee ID cards line the walls of a dark hallway as we push past them, trying to move the others away and leave them behind one final time, including himself. Daisuke, Jimmy, and Swansea can all be seen, but Anya? She's there, but ignored once again, her face covered up by the others. Even if Jimmy finally recognizes the consequences of his actions for the others, even the baby, he still refuses to see Anya. Passing through the piles of ID cards, we climb a staircase as empty bottles of mouthwash fall around us. We tried to clean everything away, leave it all behind, through wreckage, through silence. And now that we've finally done it, gotten rid of everything and everyone for our own gain, it's time to recognize the reality of the situation. It's time to take responsibility. At the top of the stairs, we find the cargo hold shrouded in darkness. The lights turn on to reveal Polly the pony atop a mountain of empty mouthwash bottles. It's responsibility, and we're here to finally admit everything. Finally, ready to face the music and do the right thing. It's also our child. It tells us that it doesn't know whether to call us boss or old man, captain or father. Jimmy says that Pony Express is dead, and so is the child. He isn't able to be either anymore. Polly apologizes to us. But Jimmy isn't having any of it. He admits that Curly tried his best, and so did he, but Curly was simply the better man. Jimmy is finally taking responsibility, and what that means is to really truly care for Curly. Curly deserved better. He sees that now. Jimmy admits that he really means it this time. He understands what he has to do now. He can still fix things. He begins to say that our worst moments don't make us monsters before he's cut off by Polly. After a kind of random Ace Attorney reference, Polly asks us the question that's been on everyone's mind. We return to reality at the dining room table. The corpses of the crew surround us, but this time Jimmy isn't hallucinating a happy ending. They're all gone because of him. We pick Curly up from the table and exit the lounge into the hallway. We're instructed to, quote, go home. We enter the utility room with the last remaining cryopod and place Curly inside. He gets to be the hero in the end, just like he wanted. Jimmy begins his final confession as the point of view returns to Curly. He recognizes that he wasn't good enough and that he ended up hurting him even if he was trying to save him. Oh, Jimmy. Still delusional to the bitter end. Jimmy thanks Curly for allowing him to be his co-pilot and friend. Says that no one can hurt him now. They fixed it. He fixed it. He finally did the right thing. Jimmy walks off screen and, well, he takes responsibility. And so we finally reached the end of our story. I hope that my examination of the events that unfolded were good enough in the end. I feel like I should treat this part like another intermission because, I mean, you guys have certainly earned it. I want to apologize again for not being able to fully understand each and every piece of symbolism this game has to offer. I think I would prefer to admit that I just don't understand something rather than to try and pick it apart for symbolism that isn't really there. But we aren't done with the analysis quite yet. I'd like to take some time here to go through each of the 5 characters and talk about what I think of their characters and their individual places in the story. I'm going to give them each a word, a flaw, that I think they represent. To be clear, I don't think this is how the developers intended it, but it's how I'm choosing to organize it. These are going to be in order of analyses I'm least confident into to most confident in, so let's continue. Blind Nihilism, Swansea. Swansea is the first character that I find pretty difficult to understand. I don't think his story is particularly complicated, in fact I think it's relatively simple, but it's more so that I have no shared experience with his story. Swansea, to me, represents the flaw of blind nihilism. He's gone through all life has to offer, the highs and the lows, and now he's approaching the end of his story. I think Swansea saw a lot of his old self within Jimmy, someone who didn't care for anyone else but himself. The difference is, Swansea was actually able to fix things in his life. I mean, he was literally a mechanic in that he actually took the steps needed to turn his life around. He represents nihilism because even after being able to change, being Jimmy showed him that there will always be miserable people in this world. Swansea shows us that our worst moments don't make us monsters, while Jimmy is the exception to that rule. He's the one that the 99.9% cleansing of the mouthwash didn't get. Swansea's nihilism and alcohol addiction blinded him to the reality of the situation until it was too late. He tried to take actions to stop it, but he was stuck. And again, it was too little, too late. Swansea also represents the overarching theme of hopelessness. The trichotomy of him, Curly, and Jimmy is really interesting to me. Curly had the power but no initiative to fix things. Jimmy had the desire without the power, and Swansea had both, but he just wasn't able to help in time. In the first scene, we get to see Anya give Swansea a sticky note that says, "I can't be expected to perform miracles." This is effectively Swansea's way of telling Curly that he can't do his job for him. The fact it was given to us through the medium of Anya is important too. You can't expect Swansea to be able to help if you don't give him the resources needed. Swansea can't do Curly's job for him. For each character, I want to bring up their position on the sorry board in the lounge as well. For Swansea, most of his pieces are towards the end. He said it himself. He's at the end of his line, and he's ready to move on with his life, away from his mistakes. Notably, one of Swansea's pieces is left next to Daisuke's. In a way, he's guiding him to a better future. I don't have that much more to say about Swansea, so let's move on. Inaction, Curly. Curly is up next and arguably is the most normal person on the ship. He most certainly has his flaws, and we'll get to that, but overall he was the better man in the end. Curly's major flaw is pretty apparent throughout the story, and that is inaction. He had the authority and desire to fix everything, to make everyone happy, but he just didn't have the spine to do anything about it. He left the whole crew behind. Swansea was overworked and he couldn't help that. Daisuke was in over his head, and Curly didn't take any action to make sure he was cared for, including not making a bigger deal about him not having a cryopod. And Jimmy was constantly slipping in front of his eyes, and he still didn't do anything about it. As for Anya, the ways he left her behind were almost countless. He didn't check in on her with a psychoval, even though she was clearly so stressed that she could barely even do her job. He didn't take action when she told him about Jimmy's assault. He didn't give her the means to protect herself. And he didn't take the action needed to stop Jimmy even after all of Anya's warnings. In the interest of being in everyone's good graces, he couldn't accept that Jimmy wasn't salvageable and that he needed to be stopped. What that would mean is anyone's guess, but I don't think it would have been too bad to just kick him off the ship at that point. He could have helped Anya move into the medical room to sleep where she could lock the door away from Jimmy. He could have spoken to corporate about what to do in the event of a dangerous person on board. And most of all, he could have prevented Jimmy from crashing the ship. Jimmy practically told him directly what he was going to do, and he just let him do it. It may have been Jimmy who was causing all of the issues, but Curly was the one who didn't stop it. And for that, he's guilty. In the conversation with Jimmy outside the utility room, Curly states that it always feels like there's something broken on the ship. I think that this is another clear nod to Jimmy always being there and obviously being an issue. Also in this scene, we can find a vent in the medical room next to Anya that will eventually lead to Daisuke's death. Interacting with it tells us that it has been broken for a while and that Curly thinks it's best to stay away from it. Another literal example of Curly ignoring his duties and shoving them off onto Swansea. Curly didn't have any pieces on the board, but I think that speaks a lot to his position in the story. Curly's text color in the game is white, and so are the spaces on the board. He's watching them all move around him while he facilitates their existence on the ship, but beyond that, he isn't doing anything to help them. He's just there, like a road to drive your car over. You need the road to not damage your car, but the road isn't going to do anything to help you if you actually run into an issue. Innocence/lack of authority. Daisuke. To me, Daisuke doesn't really have a unique flaw like Curly or Swansea did. Instead, he suffered from a type of helplessness that I'm sure many of us can relate to. When you're his age, just making it out of childhood and into the adult world, there is a decent struggle with authority. When you're a kid, you have to do what adults tell you, and while you have the ability to speak up against something you believe is wrong, that ability is often squandered by the adults' feelings that they know best simply because they're older. Daisuke was such a victim to authority that he was literally apologizing while bleeding out to his death. He's been taught that if you aren't of any commercial use, you aren't worthy of respect. He's so desperate for some amount of appreciation and recognition for his efforts that he'd literally do anything for the people who can supply that. In the end, Jimmy manipulated this part of him. Daisuke did the things he did because he just assumed that the adults around him knew better, even if he didn't like what they wanted him to do. Where Swansea tried to ease him into adulthood, teaching him what he could and making sure Daisuke never ended up like him, Jimmy took advantage. In Daisuke's Judgement section, we see his sari pieces lying on the ground around a toolbox. To me, this is what Jimmy saw him as, a tool to be used to further his own interests. We already know that Jimmy only cares for himself, but it's how he uses the rest of the crew that's so interesting. He completely ignores Anya, steps over Curly, and simply gets rid of Swansea since he was the only one who could actually stand up to Jimmy. But for Daisuke, the manipulation is painfully evident. The poor kid just wanted to be something, and Jimmy took that away too. The Sari board paints a painfully ironic truth about Daisuke's position on the crew. Inspecting it lets us know that he was apparently insanely lucky, but in the actual story, he wasn't even supposed to be on the ship at all. His existence there ensured that if something were to have gone wrong, one person would have been left behind no matter what, and I think that person would have been him. Or maybe Swansea would have given his pod away. Unfortunately, we'll never know what would have happened in that situation, but it's still interesting to speculate about. What's also interesting is that all but one of Daisuke's pieces is past the finish line. The last piece, however, still has to go through Jimmy, and we all know how that ended up. Selfishness/cowardice. Jimmy. Jimmy's position in the story is surprisingly simple. He is the epitome of a selfish coward who only cares for himself even if he thinks that he's doing the right thing. He makes a quote-unquote mistake by assaulting Anya, and in trying to save his own hide, he hurts everyone around him. He only views it as a mistake because he has to deal with the child now, not because he hurt Anya. He attempts to fix this by taking them all down with him, but this doesn't work. You can't just get rid of the consequences of your actions by washing them out. You have to face them eventually. He tries to run from the responsibility of the child at every turn, going so much to the effort to literally eradicate it during his judgment. Where Curly wasn't enough, Jimmy was actively harmful to the rest of the crew. He was awful, miserable, and inconsiderate of how anything he did affected the people around him. And what happens when you put a selfish man in control? Well, Nothing good. I have surprisingly little to say about Jimmy, but I think that's because the entire game is sort of about him. His story doesn't need to be pieced together, because at the end of the day, he's not a complex person. As for the sorry board, Jimmy's pieces are the most closely packed together. Additionally, they are all far away from every other player's pieces, except Anya's. He just couldn't leave her alone. Finally, Jimmy is the only player who still has a piece in the starting area. I think this is just another way of him saying how he wasn't making any progress while everyone else around him was normal. He wasn't just selfish and cowardly, he was resentful and jealous. I mean, name a negative personality trait and he probably has it. He's jealous of everyone else being a better person than he could ever be. Hopelessness. Anya. Anya's story in the game is what really got me into it. Her position of being a good and hopeful person being surrounded by misery without anyone to help her is just so sad. Both before and after the crash, she has barely any control over her life at all. Starting with the sort of catalyst of the story, Jimmy's assault, she tries to ask for help. We don't see the conversation directly, but when Curly speaks to her in the cockpit, we can see that he's done this before, and Curly didn't do anything to stop it from happening again. Her lack of ability to properly do her job is partially because of the severe amounts of stress she's under, but I think that a fair amount of it is that she's slowly convinced that she can't actually do it. Everyone is constantly doubting her and devaluing her intelligence, so it makes sense that it would get to her eventually. As for her final conversation with Jimmy through the door, I think it's a really good look into how she felt the whole time. She spent her whole time on the ship being walked all over, and this final decision she made was the first time she was ever truly in control. She even says it herself, this is the best decision she's ever made, even if it was an awful one. She made the call to step out before Jimmy's delusions could take her too. She'd likely be incredibly sorry to find out Daisuke died in an attempt to save her. I think what mattered most about this is that she couldn't let Jimmy get the baby, so she took matters into her own hands. Some might think this was a selfish act, but it wasn't. This was necessary. The genuine bafflement she shows when talking about how the medical room and cockpit have a lock but the sleeping quarters don't is just awful. She's been put into a miserable situation with no way to get out, and she just doesn't know what to do. What's also interesting is that Daisuke has a segment during Judgement, Swansea has a segment, Curly has a segment, and even the baby has one, but Anya? She doesn't get any attention at all. She might as well not even exist to Jimmy. Just a vessel to fulfill his desires, and that happens to be carrying his child. Between her ID cards still being covered up and ignored at the end, and her dead body literally being invisible to Jimmy, it really rubs in how little he cared for her, how little anyone cared. You know, her and Daisuke used to get super competitive during game night. He was always insanely lucky. It's a shame she can't say the same. And finally, Anya's pieces on the sorry board are the most spread out. They aren't near anyone else's pieces, and I'm interpreting this as the rest of the crew just not being able to see her. It was clear that Swansea and Curly cared. Daisuke likely would have as well if he knew, but it was such an out-of-sight, out-of-mind situation that she went unnoticed. Alone to figure things out for herself. The fact that none of her pieces are next to each other could also represent how stressed she was. She was so scatterbrained that she could barely do her duties on the ship. I don't blame her. And finally, one of her pieces is actually near another player, and that one is Jimmy's. I think that's meant to show the whole, I have to believe our worst moments don't make us monsters thing. Part of her still genuinely believes that there might be some good left in Jimmy. I said it earlier, but she needs to believe this because, if not, she's stuck on a ship, stranded in space with a monster. Truly and utterly hopeless. And that finally brings us to the end of the video. I am so tired, but I'm really glad that I had the chance to talk about this game. I know that I missed a lot of things, and upon going through and editing it all together, it took a lot not to go back and stitch more and more into the script. Things like how Anya tells Curly in the beginning that the evaluations aren't just for him, and so much more. I don't think it's realistic to touch on every single thing this game has to offer, and I think I'll have to be okay with missing out on some things. This is my first experience with a hyperfixation on this level, and let me tell you that it isn't as fun as I thought it would be. I think the reason I latched onto this game so much is that despite what some of you may choose to believe, I am a woman who was sexually assaulted in the past, and I can attest to the feeling of hopelessness you get when you ask people for help, and they don't believe you because they weren't there. My assault was almost 5 years ago, and I've only now begun to talk about it all. All this is saying that Anya's story hit me pretty heavily. My experience is obviously not as bad as hers, but I hope you can understand where I'm coming from. I also have to say that it took everything in me to not rush this out. It's such a shame that YouTube inherently feels competitive, because watching everyone else post about it before me was bothersome, to say the least. I just hope this video doesn't do any worse because it came out after other people talked about it. Anyways, thank you so much for supporting this shift in content I've been trying. I can't guarantee that I'll be able to post a video of this scale for a while, but I'll most certainly try. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel and enabling me to do videos like these. And thank you again for watching. Bye-bye.